Hi there, I'm Milt Heinrich. I am the judge for this year's show, Anac show. I've done this now, I think this might be my fourth time in about 25 years, maybe my third time. I have to say that this is the best show in terms of quality that I have seen in that time. This gallery has really grown, your club has really grown, and I want to congratulate you on that. In the past, I was the chair of the art department of Dana College. I've worked in art, produced art all my life. When I retired from Dana, I became a full-time artist myself, and now just work in my studio and enjoy that thoroughly. And on occasion, I sneak out of the studio and I get to do things like this. So thank you for inviting me to come and be the judge for this show. Okay, so every other year, I watch these dog shows on TV, and the judges going around, and how do they judge a terrier against a sheepdog? And judging a show like this is like terriers and sheepdogs. And my favorite, golden doodles, but they don't get into shows these days. Okay, so the first thing is you have to know the particular breed. So I have to know the particular style and ask the appropriate questions of that style, and not try to judge an abstract painting against a recognizable or naturalistic painting. They have two different questions or series of questions that are asked. But there are three overall questions that I always ask in a judging like this, or I would ask of my students' work. And these questions are not my own. They came from Goethe, the guy who wrote Faust. And he said about art, he says, what is the artist trying to say? How well was it said, and was it worth the doing? So those are the three things I always look at when I look at each of the work. The works that we have here, of those three, my own work, of those three questions, they aren't always equally strong. And so some of those will be a little stronger in one area of one painting, and I'm balancing that against the strength of another question in another painting. So I hope that is helpful as we start looking at these works. So first and foremost, just being in this show is an award in itself. And the primary and first judge of the show is you. You did more than one piece this year. I don't know if you've done 30 pieces or if you've done 3 pieces, but what you entered into this show was your best. And we are trying to celebrate the best. So this is a celebration of all of you. And to rank the work beyond that becomes a little artificial. And in fact, becomes my opinion or gut. And if there's anything that is the least important of any of this jurying, it's who's first, who's second, who's on third, who's on fourth, what's on fourth, and so forth. So as I make these comments, I'm not going to talk about honorable mentions and who gets into the Anac show as a whole, but I will then talk about the piece that is the best, in my opinion, today with this barometric pressure, what is the best piece in the show. Okay, here's where we're going to start. And we're going to start with this piece because as you come through the door, this is diagonally across from the door, and a very strong piece that you may be the first piece that you see when you enter the gallery. So if I ask of this piece, those 3 questions, what is the artist trying to say? I think the artist, more than anything else, is trying to say joy and happiness. How do you paint joy or happiness? I mean, that's a feeling. It's more than the object itself. So there's some magic, there's some art that is there. What is the artist trying to say? How well is it said? Well, we certainly have a portrait that we understand and can recognize who this individual was, or is, excuse me. So if we had 60 people in the room and this person was one of them, we could all figure out who that individual is. So how well was it said? It was meant to recognize an individual, and that was done very well. Is it worth the doing? As a 75-year-old individual myself, looking at another person who is in their golden ages and seeing the joy in her, that's worth saying. This is also, if we talk about, is it worth the doing, we're really talking about creativity. This just isn't a portrait that is a head on a stick. It encompasses a whole environment and a story in itself. So I think that this is an excellent piece for the show. Okay, this is our second piece as we go around the room. And obviously, it's an iris. One of the things that is really magical about this piece is the light. And when we deal with naturalistic pieces, trying to capture light certainly is one of the most elusive of the characteristics that we struggle with. Compositionally, it's interesting that the most foreground shape is probably one of the least detailed masses. And so we have this, this mass back here and this mass here, and then all of the small shapes sandwiched in between that. A really good compositional statement. So I'm walking around the gallery, and now this is the next piece I'm looking at, but I looked down the way and found that there is a characteristic, not only in the piece that I talked about before, the light being captured in that piece, but the light is being captured in the next four pieces, all very successfully. This is a tremendous celebration in itself. It's, as I now review the whole show, it's one of the things that gives the show the strength that it has. Interestingly enough, compositionally and from a light standpoint, you have this going on and that going on. This is a painting more about reflections of light than it is about the subject itself. And there again, is it worth the doing? It's worth the doing because the artist is taking something that everybody passes by and says, don't just look at the flowers, look at the table. That's what artists try to do. It's the end of March today. In fact, the last day of March. And it is cold and it is damp and the chill is going right through me, and it goes right through me and it goes right into this painting. This is Nebraska. In fact, I live in an area where I've got a creek behind my house that's very similar to this. And I've personally gone back there and tried to do some paintings, and I find them very difficult to do because everything is so much alike. And how do you find a focal point in this? How do you eliminate stuff? How do you draw the viewer into the piece that in the complicated woods that we have around here? This is a successful piece in doing that. How well was it said? You know, what was it? What does it say? Nebraska? How well was it said? Marvelous watercolor technique. Was it worth the doing? I think so. Once again, it's a painting about shadows as much as it is about the hillside. It's just a celebration of Nebraska. Through the gallery and come to this piece. Like the other two pieces that I've actually three pieces that I've talked about before, this is a painting that does talk about light. The light captured here, certainly the reflections, but particularly back in here, I think is very subtle and very well done. I think this is probably the best painting technically in the show. And so I want to give credit to that. I would like to know whether or not the person used their own photograph and were in Africa and did capture this themselves, or if they took it from a photograph out of, say, a National Geographic magazine. I am of a particular bias that I really suggested to my students that they use their own photographs. They found the image. To use photographs for any of you. If you use a photograph that somebody else has taken, you're basically not using your own creativity. You're saying, gee, I wish I would have thought of that. There's part of me that's glad that I don't know either way on this particular paint, and so what I'm doing is just celebrating the technique. Believe it or not, this is a flashlight. I want to put a flashlight right there because the light on this piece is just so unique coming up from the bottom. Now we're going into a little bit different area. This is far more abstract than the pieces that we've looked at before. So we have to ask abstract kind of questions. When you deal with a piece that is abstract, you're dealing at least as much with line, shape, form, texture, compositional things like balance, focal point. Those become the questions that you ask. And this piece is a real fine example of an integration of those design principles, taking almost forefront from the subject itself. It's that balance that makes this piece worthy to be in the show. Okay, so now we're going completely non-objective, no object. It's a completely abstract piece. And in this particular case, the paint kind of painted its own painting. What the artist did in this particular piece is recognize what was going on that was good and happy accidents, and luckily got enough happy accidents going to make the piece cohesive and successful. It certainly is a very pleasing piece to look at. When I was a kid, I used to love to collect rocks and polish them and so forth. This kind of falls into that category where the artist sees that it's the wet line and the wet fused part that she's drawing you into and sees in it a pleasing composition. Okay, so now we're going to a sculpture piece. Completely different way of looking at those three big questions. What is the artist trying to say? It's interesting in this piece that you really don't understand. You feel what the artist is trying to do, in that this is one of the most creative pieces that certainly the most creative piece that we've looked at so far. And so in this creative joy of the piece, do you get it just from the visual of the piece? No. On the back side of this piece is a lot of writing that the artist did. That writing helps us understand the piece. One could argue one way or another. Should it stand on its own as a visual statement, just using visual language, or this synthesis of both a literary piece and a visual piece that has a merit as, I suppose, I've never really thought about this, mixed media. To say, how well was it said? It is marvelously crafted. Was it worth the doing? Absolutely, as a creative piece. Okay, I want to talk about two things in this particular piece that I think are the strengths. One is the composition, and the other is focus. So let's talk about composition first. It's curious, the bird is almost in the center of the piece, and you don't generally want in your composition, the center of interest, to be in the center of the canvas. That's a little bit off to the side. But boy, these sticks really help push things this way, and then the balance of the tail pushing things that way. Really give a nice composition to the piece. When I was here in my first years judging this show, there were a lot of landscape painters that painted everything in focus. And that's easy to do because when I look here, this is in focus, and then I'm painting over here, and then this is in focus, and then I'm painting down here, and that's in focus, and everything becomes in focus. It's tough to realize that oftentimes the majority of the painting needs to be softer than the focal point, and this certainly is a good example of that. So keep things fuzzy. Okay, I will fully admit, full disclosure at the beginning, of all of the art forms, I am least qualified to talk about photography. So from a technical standpoint, I really can't say much. From a compositional standpoint, there's an interesting combination here that's occurring between symmetry and asymmetry. Draw a line right through the middle here. It's almost as if this side is like that side, but it isn't. And so it's that struggle between those two that particularly make the piece interesting. Point of view, a person from the top down, and then scrunching, and the story that's being told between this little child and the camera here and her hands kind of complete the whole composition and make it, in my opinion, a strong photograph. This painting's got a lot going for it, a lot of different things. First of all, when we talked about focus just before, how unfocused this area is, and yet it is in some ways the richest portion of the whole painting. Certainly makes it more interesting, and then how that sandwiches out and becomes part of the design of the hair. So from a technical standpoint, the subtlety, the softness of the background, its contrast with what's occurring in the positive shape certainly is a compositional strength. The eyes between the bird and the person, and I suppose even the drink here, all add to the story that is going on. I used to teach a class for gifted students at University of Nebraska at Lincoln during the summer. They were high school juniors. We would take a piece like this and say, okay, this is the first line of the story. I've been thinking about you. Now finish the rest of the story. I've been thinking about you, Birdie. There are so many good pieces in the show. And frankly, I don't want to be redundant in what I'm saying, but it's a great painting. What is the artist trying to say? There's a story here. How well was it said? Certainly the anatomy, the type of painting, the technology, the technical aspects of it are all very good. Compositionally, it's very good. A very interesting point of view. It's a creative piece in that from its point of view and from the standpoint of the story that it's being told. So here's another piece that I chose for this exhibition. Being a ceramic piece and coming from the tradition of functional ware, it's perhaps not as functional as some because of the waves that are in it and so forth. So it becomes more of an art piece than a functional craft piece. But coming out of that tradition, we have certain limitations and certain advantages. One of the advantages that really has been taken into account here are the textures and the variations in textures that the person has used within the piece. Aside from its historic functionality, the idea of the crafts and where it comes from, you could look at this piece just as a non-objective painting on clay also. And so then you look at it in terms of the composition, the focal point, and all of that type of stuff. And that all works nice and collectively within the shape that we have here. So I want to talk about something a little bit different on this piece, and that is where you as a viewer stand in relation to a painting. I would suggest, as you walk around the room and look at the various pieces, look at the other people who are looking at the piece and how close they're standing to the piece. You know, the Carl Bondler pieces, the little watercolors that are at the Joslin, your nose has got to be right up against them because of all of the little details, and the paintings are only so big. This one, of all of the paintings in the gallery, in my opinion, you need to stand the furthest back from in order to truly appreciate it. The closer you stand, it changes, and it kind of loses some of its composition. That's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just stating a fact. The closer you get to the piece, the more abstract it becomes. And it is a very nice balance between something that is a naturalistic subject and yet the abstract nature of these large, high contrast shapes, both high contrast in value and high contrast in color, that give the piece its strength. So now I've walked across the gallery to a painting on the other side. This one that we also chose as a winner for the show. This painting, on the other hand, is one that you want to stand quite closely to in order to see the composition, the details that are there. And so it's kind of the antithesis of the painting that we saw. The strength of this particular piece is its composition. The strong lines, this huge shape that is relatively sparse when you compare to what is happening here, and everything pointing to the color and lack of color that occurs in the piece is strong too. In fact, I hadn't really thought about that, but here you've got the piece that is in some ways very strong because of its color, because of the number of shapes that are in there, that diminishes it. But to have such a large space that is not the center of interest and yet have the strongest color, there's an interesting dichotomy that is occurring, and probably one of the reasons why I chose this piece. I chose this piece for the show because because of its medium. Pencil is often thought of as a preliminary media, not a media to use for a finished piece. And certainly this is a finished drawing. Not only is it a finished drawing, but it is excellently rendered. The composition is good, the contrast is strong. Again, it's a cow piece, like the one we've talked about that to some extent. I don't know, in some respects, perhaps the subject is a little trite, but I won't give that bad marks because of all of its other strengths. This is a wonderful photograph that has been beautifully staged. It's almost staged as a still life is staged. The objects placed where they need to be within the composition. It's also extremely theatrical. The costuming, the possible story that is being told here. It wasn't until, so I have this feeling of theater to the piece. Theater is related to literature. It wasn't until after I chose this piece that I was told that the title is Little Red Riding Hood. What a unique Little Red Riding Hood. It's almost as if Federico Fellini is doing the movie and has made some directive choices to it. So it's an excellent mystery. It's interesting to me that within this exhibition of work, we have 3 different artists who are marvelously crafted and deal with found objects and their interaction in relation to one another. This is an area of particular interest to me, when you think about it, what does a child's building block have to do with a viewfinder and a turkey? They make perfect sense in this particular composition, but just laying out on a table at first, who would ever think of putting those things together? So it's a highly creative piece. What is the story that is here? As I look at it, the more that I look at it, the more different stories come to mind. The Caged Bird Sings for Freedom. The Caged Bird. Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, one of her famous books. This all harkens to that particular piece of literature. It's interesting, these dots. Are those targets? Possibly. What else could they be? Why are they there? Are they just there for a compositional reason? I think not. Nay. With the target business, you've got these going almost as if this is a shooting gallery type of thing. I don't know if that's true. Well, it doesn't matter, quite frankly, because the artist's intent, they don't stand here next to the piece and say, this is what it means. It may see it on a sign, but in reality, what it is dependent upon your past experience as the viewer. The richer your past experience, the fact that I even know and have read Maya Angelou's Why the Caged Bird Sings adds a whole layer to this piece that perhaps somebody else who has not read it wouldn't have any idea of. So we bring our own experiences to a piece like this, take a look at it for a long time, and decide what it may mean, what stories it brings up for you. A good definition of creativity is looking at one thing and seeing something else. This particular artist looked at watches and saw something else, saw a composition, saw a story, as it were. There's no question about this piece in terms of its meaning. It has a sense of time or timelessness, depending on which way you look at it. So to have an abstract piece still have a story, that's an interesting juxtaposition. How well was it said? It is a great piece of craftsmanship, and so we know what it's trying to say. We know that it's done well, and we certainly know that it's creative, that it's worth the doing. And it's for all of those reasons that I chose this piece to be the best of show.